Okay, so from the stakeholder analysis that we'll do here will not only be applicable to your current assignment, but to the next part of the assignment. Because like I said, the information that you'll gather as a process through doing the simulation about your stakeholders, or the information you gather, will enable you to do a more of an in-depth analysis. So this will be organic, really, a development of what you're going to initially propose. Because it will become apparent that the interface between stakeholders, their influence on each other, will become more apparent as the process goes on. But in the initial stages, you could possibly implement this as a foundation from which to build. So you can start to identify initial areas of the stakeholders that you could plot onto these sort of graphs, tables, whatever we use here. So, I'll whiz through this lecture. Well, I won't whiz through it, I'll explain it, obviously. But from then on, we're going to go and do one of these networking analysis in the context of your assignment. And then in the seminar later, we'll just go through any last-minute worries that you might have about your assessment. So if you need to come and see me about that, then we'll go through those, okay? Okay, let's go. From all of the strategic aspects that I've taught you, or you've been exposed to as part of this module, one of the most important tasks during the strategy making process that you have been privy to is the management of the interface between the stakeholders and the demands of the organisations, the aims and the goals of the strategy that has been set. So we're going to look at the impact of the stakeholders, the definition of stakeholder management generically, and how that differs from the strategic stakeholder management approach that we can take in this module. The types of stakeholders, the mapping of stakeholders, and the principles of how to manage them whilst trying to increase stakeholder satisfaction. See those, yeah. So sometimes stakeholders will trigger project schemes in other organisations and can support or obstruct an ongoing project. An ongoing project could be that of your merger or acquisition, or your acquisition that you're actually doing now. So they can impact on the way or the success or the obstruction of that process. So their influence can be small or great and can be exerted either deliberately or incidentally as a consequence. So stakeholders can affect the organisation's functioning, goals and development, and even survival. Stakeholders are beneficial when they help you achieve your goals, and they are antagonistic when they oppose your mission. In effect, stakeholders have power to be either a threat or a benefit to your organisation, and that's to your organisation's strategy and to your aims and objectives. So stakeholder management generally is a systematic identification, analysis and planning of actions to communicate with, negotiate with and influence stakeholders. Stakeholders are those who have an interest or role, a stake in the project, or are impacted by the project. So it's a two-way system. It's not just that the stakeholders will influence the way that the aims and objectives or goals or strategy is being is successful or not, but it can go the other way. They can be impacted by it. So the difference between that and the strategic stakeholder management is that the stakeholder approach to strategic management is about groups and individuals who can affect the organisation, and is about managerial behaviour taken in response to those groups and individuals. So it's the umbrella for the stakeholder management, and it's more direct in the way that it's attached specifically to the strategies of the organisations, whatever that may be. And those strategies may be your acquisition, it may be the growth of the company, it may be a marketing issue, it may be anything. But so the stakeholders are specific to that specific strategy, rather than being an exercise to understand or identify people who will affect in the environment of the organisation their success necessary, or their operations. So there's two types of stakeholders: the internal, direct and primary, which all mean the same thing, and the external, indirect and secondary. So it involves, stakeholder management involves identifying and classifying these stakeholders in order that you can facilitate both initial and subsequent engagement with these people. The engagement involves identifying different categories of stakeholders, gathering information about them, identifying their missions, determining their strengths and weaknesses, their interests, their power, identifying their strategies, and trying to predict their behaviour and develop and implement a strategy for managing these people. So the internal direct primary stakeholders are the members of the project team, or those who provide finance, for example the clients, those who provide continuing support throughout the project or throughout the duration of the project for that particular strategy, from which the project cannot survive. So these are crucial people to the process. They're contracted to provide services, i.e. the contractors, subcontractors, suppliers, whoever is involved in this situation. And the external, indirect and secondary stakeholders are those affected by the project in a significant way. Those affected by the project in a significant way, i.e. local government, but don't have a direct stake in the project. Those who influence or are influenced by the project but are not essential to its survival, and no contract responsibility to those involved in that particular strategy. So from the primary and secondary players, you can also start to narrow this down even further to primary players, which are apparent on the first, second and third level, and secondary players to the first, second and third level. This is a very basic approach, but it's a start that will get you thinking about who your stakeholders are. It's a very superficial approach, but it's just about identifying them at this stage. So once you've identified who these people are, you need to start mapping them. And the objective of that is to develop a list, to assess their key characteristics, and present their information in a way that helps the management teams manage their stakeholders effectively, so to realise the strategic goals. This is a visual process. It's a visual aid to aid with the management of these stakeholders. So the importance is to aid the understanding of complex data. Information that you've gathered on each of the stakeholders that will influence the way or the direction in which you may go with your strategy. As I said, it's a visual tool. It's to visualise the stakeholder community surrounding the particular business unit or project, and the picture tells 1,000 words. If you can visualise something, you can start to comprehend the complexity of the interactions between the stakeholders. Suggest up-to-date strategies for management and communication between the various groups. By understanding the stakeholders and where they fall within the context of the organisation, you will be able to manage and communicate with them more efficiently. And manage resource and time and use these where most appropriate the benefit will be derived. So one system of doing this, and this is a very prescriptive approach, is that you identify the stakeholders, you identify the stakeholder needs and concerns, the impact that they will have on your strategy, the evaluation of alternative solutions, and then eventually gaining a level of acceptance. And the acceptance is that of you meeting the expectations that they have, their aims and objectives, their goals. And there's various ways of doing that, and these are just a few of them. And we're going to go through the majority of these actually, but as a process rather than as in isolation. So these are the primary questions that we're going to answer. These are the primary questions that you will need to answer as part of your analysis. That's who are they, what do they want, and how are they going to go and try to get it. So who are they, what interests do they have, and what power do they hold within the company or within the remit of the programme. Now one way, again, of doing this is through this power, legitimacy and urgency model. Have you seen this before? Some of you yes, some of you no. Okay, so again, this is quite superficial in its current state, in the way that it's presented here. And these are the meanings behind all of these parts: the legitimacy, the perceived validity to the stake. This is quite a controversial, subjective view of the legitimacy of the stakeholders. And it implies that stakeholder demands comply with prevailing norms and beliefs, which is not always the case. There's more dynamism to all of this. The power is the capacity to induce or persuade or coerce the actions of others, and is displayed when one part in a relationship is able to impose, that's supposed to impose, its will on other parts. Again, this is quite a subjective aspect, and I'll go into this a bit more in a minute. When Ackerman and Eden, this research that I'm going to present to you soon, did their research, they left it up to the interpretation of the participants mapping these stakeholders as to what power meant to them, whether it be political or whether it be social or whether it be coercive or symbolic or part of the material functions. So they left the interpretation up to them, and we'll define that a little bit later on. And the urgency is the intensity of the claim, attention and priority attached to the stake. It's also the degree to which a claim demands immediate attention. So it's associated with stakes, and is often static, but it's not static but dynamic. Again, so the urgency of a stakeholder at any one point in that project, any one point in the acquisition, may differ at different is differing at different stages. So that this whole process is very dynamic. Of mapping stakeholders and monitoring them, because the power that people have at one point of the project may not be the power that they have at another point of the project, and that's where this constant monitoring of this and evaluation of who they are, what they want, and their urgency and legitimacy in the project will change. So again, we'll touch on that towards the end. So to further define this, have you seen this further definition of the power, urgency and legitimacy? This breaks down this Venn diagram a little bit more. Again, it's fairly superficial in that it's basically a list of stakeholders that is determined by the subjectivity of the team itself. So, for example, you still remain with the power, legitimacy and urgency, and there's an additional 4 categories that are now apparent within this diagram. So there's a crossover. You can further define the people a little bit more. So we have the dormant stakeholders in the power situation, which are these are people who have the power but have no legitimacy in the stake, and have no urgency in the strategy or the strategy itself. The discretionary ones are, they have legitimacy but no power and no agency, and the demanding ones have obviously no power and legitimacy. But in between that, you can see the crossover, and we have the dominant stakeholders who have power and legitimacy but no urgency, and you can work the rest out for yourself. So the most defined stakeholders within the project, or the most important stakeholders that you can then define, are these groups here with the definitive stakeholders. They have the legitimacy, the power and the urgency. So that's one way of plotting these people on the Venn diagram, rather than just through power, legitimacy and urgency. This is where the research starts. They sort of ignored that model, if you like, and developed the more prevalent ones to understand who their stakeholders were in a strategic sense. And this is the most well known, which is a power interest grid. And research generally uses this, as I said before, to establish the company's environment. However, it can also be used to enable managers to proactively manage their stakeholders in the context of the strategy. So this is slightly different and slightly adapted. Now this grid here was adapted by the 15 organisations, sorry, it was done over 15 years and in 6 organisations, I think it was. So these were the was the output of what was perceived in the language that was perceived by the organisations as being more useful for them. So, as I said, power was also ill-defined in literature, and he left the management team. They left it up to the management team to define what power is, like I said before, because again, it's quite subjective. And I'll go into how they defined it in a bit. So, obviously how it works, the more interests that the people have, the higher on the grid, the more power they have, the higher on that grid as well. So, but people were misusing the way that they were doing it. And if I gave you this exercise now, and gave it the exercise when I've explained it, it would be two different approaches of how to do it. People were randomly putting them into a box that didn't define them sufficiently enough. So they would put them in subjects, and there was no particular logic behind what they were doing. So the best way to tackle these is to use the axis to plot the stakeholders on there. So this is to be done twice actually. So you identify your stakeholders, and then you plot how much power they have along this grid here. And then you do the same exercise and you plot them again on the interest, and then you draw a parallel to there. So there's a definitive spot in which they can be used. And how they benchmark this is to identify the initial key players, or the key stakeholder, and then benchmarked it against there. So they'd say the person with the most interest and the most power was up here or here, and then they plot back from that. I should know that. I always tell people not to do that, and we don't do it. Okay, so is that clear? Of how to actually use this, grid. So the four categories are evident: those with low power, low interest, and this has been determined as the crowd. Could be an infinitive number of people who have a stake in the strategy or in the acquisition. but would not necessarily have much interest or power. There'll be a lot of people in there, hence the name, the crowd. But is not something that should necessarily be monitored or managed. It's just to be aware that these people are there, unless they could be coerced by others, but we'll talk about that in a minute. We have subjects which have low power and high interest, and these could be both positive and negative. It's not just the interest as being in a positive sense, but also could also be in a damaging sense. Management could encourage coalitions to increase power of positive and convert them to players or neutralise to positive. So by identifying who these people are, you could then use this as a tool to try and coerce or convert people's interests or power. Context setters are high power with low interest. They can influence future overall context. Management should seek to raise awareness and develop positive interest and convert them into players. So it's all about identifying who they are and then potentially coercing or converting them to be, regardless of whether they're positive or negative, either way. If they have a positive influence and power, then obviously we want to maintain that or encourage that further. Or if they have a negative impact in the context settings, perhaps of the power, we need to try and convert that so that they have less power. And obviously the high power of people with high interest and high power and are significant stakeholders. So they developed this further because, again, this was quite basic in its development. And when stakeholders respond to a particular organisational action, they do so with respect to other stakeholders as well as the focal organisation. So people began to realise that it wasn't just the people's organisational, the people in the organisation's opinion of this, but how could the coercion or conversion of these people, whether they be positive or negative to the organisation's strategy, be influenced outside of the power of the management. So what were the formal and informal networks that could be developed from this? So it can depend on the informal relationships that are being formed within the organisation. And instead of analysing individuals' behaviours, attitudes and beliefs, social network analysis focuses its attention on how these interactions constitute a framework or structure that can be studied and analysed in its own right. So this is still maintained, this is still done at a higher level, at a management high level, about the people who are involved within the project. But like I said, this network needs to be more organic, and it needs to develop. And how it is developed is through something like this. So you've plotted your stakeholders on the power interest matrix, and then you start to have the conversations about who influences who has, if it's an informal relations, it could be who shares a car with somebody in the morning, who plays golf with them, whose kids go to the same school, who do they sit with at lunch, who are their friends, their networks, who do they go down to the pub with, who always go out in the same group. And it's trying to identify these types of groups of people and start to link them up wherever they are on the power interest matrix to understand the influences that these people may have. So it depicts the relationships between the stakeholders with linking arrows. And the direction of the arrows indicate the nature of the relationship. So the head being the influencing two, it could be either way. So it could have a double arrow on the influence. But it's important to distinguish between the formal and the informal networks as well. The formal obviously could be hierarchical, could be contractual, there could be the reporting lines, i.e. employee, supervisor, agency to government department, subsidiary to corporate office, so it could be departmental, and as I said before, the informal ones are the ones where at the more social side of things. So you can do this by the formal lines being the stronger lines and the informal lines being these dotted lines here, so it becomes more visual. So by capturing formal and informal stakeholder relationships graphically in the form of this map or a network analysis, it also allows analysis of the enhanced network. The analysis suggests stakeholders shown as being linked into many relationships would be likely to be seen as significant by other stakeholders. So by doing this, not only are you identifying who the informal networks, but you're identifying how these could be coerced or converted and consequently managed. And the importance of these people could then shift, and that's the reason for them being done on sticky notes. Because what this network analysis throws up is that people who have a lot of lines going to them, obviously this one's already up here, but people who have a lot of lines going to them, or a lot of arrows going to them, or coming from them, could potentially identify stakeholders that were not necessarily first deemed as being important or having much power. And therefore, by identifying, you can then move these people up into the appropriate quadrant, because you then believe that these people are privy to a lot of information, they network in the right circles. It's just that they've been misplaced or not identified previously. So this enhances their potential power, the potential interest that they have in the project or in the strategy. And the stakeholders with this type of centrality have the potential to be useful allies or powerful enemies. So it's about identifying these people that could potentially ruin or promote a strategy in the organisation. And this is useful if you're using a more informal form of communications through the grapevine, etc. If you're we talked about change a lot, and it's about communicating through the right channels. And if you identify what those channels are, you can manage the process a lot more efficiently. So the stakeholder influence network can be used as a strategy to influence and so change stakeholders' opinions and actions. So as I said before, by identifying these people, you can start to influence their decisions and their opinions and actions. So you select the key stakeholders from the power interest grid, because this is where the research started to develop. These things already existed. Stakeholder analysis, network analysis already exists in isolation. The power interest grid always happens in isolation. By bringing these two together and then developing that further, it created a more in-depth approach to stakeholder analysis. So select the stakeholders that have high interest and high power from the power interest grid, and refined it in light. They then refined it in light of their network links. This could be used to make a stakeholder management web, which we're going to look at now, for each of the selected stakeholders. I'll just go through a couple of slides before I go into how that has developed, that stakeholder web. So the stakeholder dynamics, social networks that focus on their relationships between stakeholders can reveal both responses and counter-responses to organisational actions. And reflecting on stakeholder interactions is likely to suggest potential coalitions, so that you can identify groups of people and the power that they may have. And as far as your simulation is concerned, this is another simulation that I do, but this is Prendo's take on a network analysis. starts to also group these people in functions by colour coding their functional group within their, the analysis. And it looks at the peripheral person, the boundary spanners, and starts to identify central people, people who are central to networking, and where your communication efforts could potentially be concentrated. And boundary spanners are also important because they're the people who will go across, as the very nature of the word, boundaries to influence two different functional sets of people. So again, the lines are determining the strength of the relationship and the connections between them, whether they be formal or informal. So the power interest grids and network influence diagrams are valuable formats for stakeholder analysis, but they don't explicitly address how to manage them. So we identified who they are and what they want, but not how to manage them. So the process and discussions that surrounded the process of mapping the stakeholder is a valuable exercise. So what they found was that in the process of actually mapping out these stakeholders and the conversations that they had in the team to identify who these people are, through a lot of personal information or valuable information that identified them in their different networks. Well, yeah, he goes to school with his child and they play golf together, and all this information started to come out, which was great for the research and something that was quite tacit, nothing that had been captured formally before, but was valuable for the organisations to understand because it could influence or impact on the strategy that they had. But a more usable technique would provide more analytical help in determining stakeholder management strategies. So this is what they developed. And this is something that can be used on each of the stakeholders. The stakeholder is positioned on the interest power line, the axis, and above and below that I'll explain what that happens. So further insights arise from exploring the non-obvious basis of interest and power. And the boxed contributions at the bottom half, these ones, are the way that that particular stakeholder sees the world. So in this case, they see the world as, or their strategy or their company as having value for money, a tight budgetary adherence, a review of procedures. So this is about them and how they see themselves and what they are, their aims or their expectations almost of themselves are. The circles, the oval shapes, are taken directly from the power interest matrix in the same quadrant as the focused stakeholder here. So these are the people who have an impact on the decisions that this key stakeholder has. So above the line, the box contributions above the line reveal its way of acting in the world. So what they see the world as, and this is the way they act, and what they do is above the line. So they change allocation of finance, they alter allocation of funding, the chief accounting requires all the procedures. So this is what they do. So as I said before, the oval ones are directly from the stakeholder influence network and indicate those parts of the network the focal stakeholder uses as basis of its power. So they use these people as part of their power. It's more evident as to who their network influences are. Similar in the way in the thin lines are the causal links. So anything in the boxes are causal links to the actual stakeholder itself, and the ones with the dotted lines, the bold lines are the formal influences, which are depicted in the actual organisations, and the informal influences are those that are attached to particular people itself, so informal networks that they have. So by doing this, you can then start to micro-analyse each stakeholder, and you can do this in your project now for your assignment. However, this will become more apparent and more dynamic when you have actually done the simulation, when you start to talk to these people and understand who influences who. You can make assumptions at this point, but again, this will become more apparent when you actually do the simulation. And like I said before, this is a dynamic model, and it should have constant monitoring, because this will change throughout the course of the project. So once you've identified who they are, what they want, and who they influence, etc., you need to, you need to monitor them. Compositions of coalitions could change with prevalent circumstances, and therefore this needs to be monitored. You need to be proactive rather than reactive to these situations. So by doing the initial identification, you will then be able to be more proactive when you understand who they are and what they're about. But to continuously assess the stakeholders' power and interest will inform the choice of approaches for engaging with them. How do you manage them, and how do you engage with these people? So there are, I think, 7 principles for managing stakeholders. So once you've done that, you need to be able to manage them and monitor them. So you monitor the concerns, you acknowledge and actively monitor the concerns of the legitimate stakeholders, and you take their interests appropriately into account in decision making and operations. This is a process that you will have to do as part of the simulation. Continually monitor their concerns. Their concerns may change, but ultimately you need to be proactively monitoring these in order to make the decisions that you make about your strategy. Listen to what they have to say, and openly communicate. Once a decision's being made, you need to be able to communicate these to them efficiently. It's exactly the same as any change scenario, when you need to communicate to these people to let them know what's going on. And they should communicate with stakeholders about their respective concerns and contributions. So it's about directing the communication specifically to their and tailored to their concerns, letting them know about the risks that they could have made an assumption of. It's hard to do this on a computer simulation, is to adjust your behaviour, because behaviours don't really come into it. It's a very cold environment, and therefore the way in which you interact with them on a personal basis will not be as easy to do. But in general, in these situations, to adapt behaviour to different groups, however, information presented should be consistent. So managers should adopt processes and modes of behaviours that are sensitive to the concerns and capabilities, the capacity of the people who are being spoken to understand. And a fair distribution of the benefits and burdens to assure continued collaboration. This is a contractual, probably more of a contractual effort, I think. So it's a distribution of risks. Managers should recognise the interdependence of efforts and rewards among the stakeholders. So it's a balance, really a play-off, a negotiation between the stakeholders and the organisation as to the benefits or burdens to be shared throughout. Reduce harmful impacts and compensate affected parties. This is going to be a difficult one in your simulation, because there could potentially be some compensation required, although that's not something that you could possibly tackle in the confounds of the simulation itself. So managers work cooperatively with other entities, both public and private, to ensure that risks and harms arising from the corporate activities are minimised. They cannot be avoided, appropriately compensated. This is more contractual risk sharing. Again, managers should avoid altogether activities that might jeopardise inalienable human rights and other unacceptable activities relating to the relevant stakeholders. And conflicts of interest, corporate line versus benefits to the projects and stakeholders. This is always a contentious issue, is that managers should acknowledge the potential conflicts between their own role as corporate stakeholders and their legal and moral responsibilities to the interests of the stakeholders themselves. It's about still maintaining the corporate line, but being able to influence or communicate that at a lower level, whilst understanding the legal and moral obligations that they have to the stakeholders. So once these are all done, it's about sustaining this effort of managing the stakeholders. So you need to provide active involvement of all stakeholders who can affect and be affected by the project early in the project. When you're talking in your simulation, you need to engage with these people as soon as possible. You need to get them on board. You need them to buy into your aims and objectives after understanding who they are and what power they have and interest in the project. You need to promote trust and credibility, and this can be done through communication and being honest and open. And implement early communication and persuasion, coercion, etc. The communication strategy should appreciate stakeholders' differences and cater for their requirements. But as you will come to realise, and this will be very frustrating for you, it's difficult to satisfy all groups of the project stakeholders at different levels. I think the most poignant part of all this is manage their expectations, not their happiness. Happiness and expectations are two very different things. There's more boundaries related to expectations than there are to people's happiness, or levels of happiness. So identify the stakeholders, who they are, what their power and interests are, manage their expectations as best possible by being proactive and communicating efficiently. So from here, what we're going to do now is have a 5-minute break. 10 minutes, where are we? 10 minutes? 2 o'clock?
Yep.
And back here, we'll do this exercise and see how we get on. Okay?